Welcome to another episode of Equity Mates, a podcast where we explore what's possible in the world of elections. If you've just joined us for the very first time, my name's Bryce, and as always, I'm joined by my equity buddy, Ren. How are you going?
I'm very good, Bryce. Very excited for this episode. Eagle-eared listeners may have heard you change your intro there. We're not exploring what's possible in the world of investing today. We are releasing our election special.
Yeah.
This episode is our housing episode, and then we've got an episode that was released beside this, interviewing both of the potential treasurers.
Yes.
So the Australian election is coming up. Well, early voting is open, but 3rd of May is the date, and there's no doubt that I would say the biggest policy debate for this election has become housing.
Absolutely. So in today's episode, we have the privilege of speaking to the Housing Minister, Clare O'Neil, and the Shadow Housing Minister, Michael Sukkar, to get their view on Australian housing.
Yeah. Now, we want to contextualize these interviews because obviously there was one weekend where there was some big housing announcements made. On the Labor side, there was 5% deposits for first home buyers and a $100 billion plan to build homes specifically for first home buyers. And on the Liberal Party side, there was the previously announced policy of super for housing, where you could withdraw
50,000.
up to 40% of your super to up to 50,000 to put it towards a deposit. And then Peter Dutton also announced tax deductibility of mortgages up to $650K, up to a certain housing value for the first 5 years of the mortgage. So there were some big housing policies announced. The first interviews we did with Claire and Michael, if I can call them that, were done before those announcements in mid-April. We reached out to both sides to ask if they wanted to come back on to chat about the policy announcements. The Liberal Party didn't want to. Well, we didn't hear back from them, but Clare O'Neil did come back on. So we've got a bit of a two-parter with Claire. But Bryce, look, we don't want to be accused of playing favourites here.
No.
So we even have thought about how we're going to sequence these interviews because both interviews are in this episode. And the only fair way to do it is to toss a coin.
So we've got a coin flip here, digital, obviously. I don't think anyone carries coins in their pockets. Very few people do. We'll say tails is Claire and heads is Michael.
Yep.
3, 2, 1. Heads is the flip, so Michael goes first.
Sounds good. All right. Well, here is our interview with the Shadow Housing Minister, Michael Sukkar.
Well, Michael, welcome to Equity Mates.
Bryce, thanks for having me. Alec, good to be with you as well.
We're really excited to have you on. Now, Michael, this election is going to be characterised by the ways in which you disagree with the opposition and the ways, your opposition and the way in which they disagree with you. So to kick us off, what's one area that you agree with them on?
Well, I think we're in heated agreement that, for example, in the housing space, that the root of so many of the issues we face today is a lack of supply. So we agree on the problem. I would have some pretty serious criticisms of their inability to deal with that problem, but we at least agree on the problem, which actually is not a bad starting point, for any kind of issue, political or otherwise, that you got to deal with.
Well, we want to unpack the supply side in a little bit, Michael, but I think just to couch this conversation, we obviously are going to focus on housing because it is a policy that is certainly one that is incredibly relevant to the Equity Mates audience. So to understand how you would approach the issue and I guess to get some more insight beyond the supply side, like what is the issue with housing?
Well, at its simplest, we have demands for housing that outweigh its supply. And we have supply that's not able to quickly respond to demand pressures because of the constraints on actually getting more product onto the market. In general, as you guys well know and your audience well knows, in most markets where you have a spike in demand, there's a whole lot of very willing participants in the market who are willing to meet that demand with supply. And of course, that fluctuates and you can have short-term hits. But in housing, it is so difficult to have a quick response to demand because of the myriad of hurdles in the way, whether that's planning, zoning issues, whether it's the fact that governments have decided to tax the hell out of housing. And as we know from cigarettes, if you want people to do less of something, you tax it more. If you want less houses, tax it more. And that's basically what we've had governments do in this country. So at its simplest, it's demand that exceeds the ability of supply to respond. And I think it's been exacerbated in the last couple of years with a migration program that's been ramped up to more than 500,000 people a year when we're building fewer homes. And it's not a criticism or a knock on those migrants to our country, but you've got to have a sense of whenever you're running a migration program or a population policy, can we actually put roofs over these people's heads? And at the moment, there's far too much demand being fueled by high immigration with supply that's unable to respond.
Yeah, well, we want to talk about the demand side as well, so we'll put a pin in that immigration point. But you've mentioned a couple of the supply issues there, planning, zoning, tax policy. I'm sure there's others. And I think to frame this question, we should start with the National Housing Accord, which was to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years between the states and the federal government, starting in July 2024. We're less than a year in, and we're already behind the target, and experts think we probably won't be able to catch up to the target. So why is it so hard to build housing in Australia? And if you do become the housing minister, what are the changes you can make at a federal level to try and get us back on track to that 5-year target?
Well, Alec, I think you're very polite to say we're unlikely to meet it. The Master Builders Association, who are probably more generous than me, think that the government's going to miss that target by 350,000 homes. I think they'll be lucky to get to 800,000 homes, so 400,000 short of their target. And to put that into some historical context, in the last 5 years of the former coalition government, we built more than 1 million homes. So we should be able to build 1 million homes over a 5-year period. The fact that it's gone backwards and we're looking like more likely to be around 800,000 over the next 5 years with record levels of migration, I think is a huge problem. But to go to your question, what are the other constraints? Well, yes, planning and zoning are big issues, but I can tell you right now in most markets in this country, we do have developers who are sitting on approvals. So they've received the approval from the local government or the state government, but the project no longer stacks up because the costs associated with building the product are higher than what they can sell it for at the end. So, talking to a pretty big developer in Sydney, said, look, very difficult for them to get a 2-bedroom apartment out of the ground for less than 800,000.
Wow.
Once you put a margin on top of that, there's actually no market for it in this particular suburb that they were talking about. So they've got the land, they've got the approval, the piece of paper from the local government to go ahead with the project, but no one's going to put their money on the line, A, if there's no margin, and B, they're going to lose money on the project. So that's the huge issue. And I mean, the sort of the dirty secret of those big projects has been obviously the impact of the CFMEU, amongst other issues that have caused spikes in prices. Obviously, materials, costs of labour have gone up too because of the shortage of skill. But in my home state of Victoria, I'm a very parochial Victorian. People understand that they pay a 30% CFMEU tax here. To build anything in Victoria costs 30% more because of the lack of productivity that's driven by a pretty lawless and aggressive union, who, quite frankly, they are a part of the Labor Party. So the Labor Party find it impossible to stand up to them. So I think we're going to have to attack the cost structure of those sorts of projects to get them up. Another thing I've announced is just the regulation and red tape that we put on construction. And we have this thing called the National Construction Code that keeps getting reformed every few years, that just adds layer and layers of cost onto new homes. In essence, we expect people who build new homes today, homes, apartments, townhouses, to almost have, gold taps. You've got to have the highest spec in every single way possible the latest round of NCC changes, which mandated a whole lot of additional environmental related changes and livability standards, added about $40,000 to the cost of a new home, just in those higher standards. Now, if you're a first home buyer struggling to get that deposit together, that $40,000 uplift, and we're not talking about $40,000 in things you can see, these are just $40,000 of additional requirements that go into the building. They might be nice to have, and if you can afford it, good luck to you, but it's the difference between owning a home for many people or not owning a home, and it's the difference between a builder being able to actually make a quid out of it or not. And, you know, the dirty secret for everyone out there is if a builder can't make money on a project, then it doesn't go ahead, because builders don't work for free, and they're not all rolling around in Bentleys and Rolls Royces. These are just normal, hard-working small business people. So that's a couple of ways I think we could help strip cost out. And finally, I'd say taxes. I mean, state governments in particular, they are addicted at taxing property. And, you know, in New South Wales, for example, let's just take that apartment I was talking about earlier that cost $800,000 to build. Let's just assume that developer could get $1 million for it. So they've got a 20% margin. 50% of the cost of that apartment, so $400,000, is taxes and regulatory charges and other holding costs. So, you know, any politician who gets up, you know, with crocodile tears talking about housing affordability, the governments, predominantly state governments, are taxing half the value. And, you know, that again is an area where if we want more houses, I think we've got to tax them less, not more.
Wow. I didn't know that stat around the amount of the cost came from taxes and regulations.
Yeah, it's about 50% in New South Wales. In Victoria, it's probably a touch lower. It's probably in the mid-40s. You know, in Queensland, it's probably around 40. But in any event, you're talking a huge proportion of the cost of a new home. And, you know, no wonder we've got some of the most expensive housing in the world if we're taxing the hell out of it like that.
Now, you mentioned costs there, and one thing that we've certainly been noticing and hearing about is just the amount of builders falling into insolvency. I think ASIC had some data that in the 24 financial year was almost 3,000 construction companies went into insolvency, and, you know, they've spoken about rising costs and difficulties there. How do you think about having enough, not just supply of houses, but supply of construction companies and builders to actually build the houses that we need?
Well, it's critically important. And when I was Housing Minister during COVID, we put in place the Home Builder Program, which was a huge stimulus for the building industry. And it was a $25,000 grant to help people build a new home or undertake a really substantial renovation of a home. And the reason we did that was not actually, to be frank, for the first home buyer or the recipient of that grant. The purpose of the grant was to keep the nearly 500,000 people in the residential construction industry employed, because once you lose people from an industry, it's very hard to get them back. And if you lose those people, then all of a sudden the productive ability of the sector to build the more than 200,000 homes we need diminishes even further. So I am very alarmed that we've seen a record number of insolvencies. In the end, people who will shut up shop and move on and say, you know what, this is too hard. There are easier ways to make money. So you not only lose a really significant portion of people, you lose a whole lot of accumulated experience in the industry as well. So you make a good point. It's a huge issue for the industry. Highest number of insolvencies and liquidations we've seen really since we've been keeping records. And I think it is a huge concern. And again, disappointing that we've seen nothing from the government. I can tell you as Housing Minister during COVID, I did a whole lot of things that I never planned to do, but you've got to respond to the challenges that you face at the time, even if they're not necessarily on the agenda when you were asking for people to vote for you. And I think this government has failed to actually be nimble enough to to do things to support the industry at a time when we're losing a record number of particularly small businesses.
So, Michael, this government has really been focused on the supply side response, which is sort of no surprise, headlined by the Housing Australia Future Fund. Would love to get your thoughts on what you think of this as being the focus for the solution.
Well, they've only been focused on social and affordable housing, which really relates to about 2% of the market. They've been focused on government-funded projects to provide social and affordable housing. Now, that's very worthy and something that I invested a lot in when I was Housing Minister. But 98% of the market is the private industry. That's what drives supply in the market, and we've seen nothing, which is part of the reason why we've seen housing commencements down, housing completions down, sadly housing approvals down too. So that means over the next 12 to 18 months, even fewer homes are going to be built because those approvals are ultimately your houses on the ground in 12 or 18 months' time, because they have not focused at all on the private market. Now, they have set aside in their Housing Australia Future Fund $10 billion. They've now been in government for 3 years. That fund has not delivered one house. It's not delivered one house in 3 years because governments are not known for being quick. They're not known for moving very quickly, and they're not known for value for money. So the solution here isn't about the government trying to fund more homes. The solution has to be, how do you facilitate the industry to do more? How do you facilitate them by way of reduced red tape and regulation, helping them with the skills that they need? I mean, for example, in the last financial year, we brought in more yoga instructors and fitness instructors than we did bricklayers. So, I've got nothing against yoga instructors, and we all should probably spend more time with a fitness instructor, but more than bricklayers. I mean, are you serious? And so that shows the priorities of the government, and you, in the end, got to give the industry the tools they need to build more. If you're relying on the government, well, what will happen is where we are now. $10 billion set aside, 3 years later, not one home built. And that's not helping anybody.
So, Michael, one last question on supply, and then would love to turn to some of the demand side factors. Obviously, as federal minister, you would have some responsibility over some regulations, but a lot of the housing and housing regulations, planning regulations, zoning regulations sit with the states. How would you influence the states, and what levers would you pull, or how would you get them to be singing from the same hymn book when it comes to driving private activity in the construction sector?
Well, Alec, I'm very pessimistic about the states all having a sudden form reversal and all of a sudden becoming, really keen to facilitate supply. Let's be frank, they all say the right thing. The politicians have worked out what they need to say to people. Making it happen, doing what they need to do, are two different things. I can tell you, as a former Commonwealth Housing Minister, wading through the bureaucracies, I used to have a really good conversation with a state housing minister, and then they would be overridden by the planning minister, who was a different person normally, or the treasurer, who was a different person. And the blockage that we had at a state and territory level was huge. So to be frank, our approach will be, look, if states want to talk turkey, very happy to do so. But if I go to the election saying I'm going to get the state ministers around a table, we're going to sing Kumbaya, and all of a sudden there's going to be this flood of homes, I'm going to have a lot of very disappointed people. So what we've decided to do is we've set up a new fund, housing infrastructure program, which we think will unlock about 500,000 new homes. And we know roughly where those projects are because we've run a pretty exhaustive process with local governments, more than 100 local governments around the country. Basically what we're going to do, it's not our job, but we're going to do it anyway. We're going to fund the small scale infrastructure that gets these projects going. As I said earlier, there's a lot of projects that have been approved, but they're not going ahead because there's not enough money to make it happen. One of those areas where there's not enough money is the money to put in the roads, the water, the sewage, the telecommunications, really basic stuff. It's not very sexy. It doesn't look good on a media release, but it is the stuff that gets housing projects going. $5 billion. We're going to fund the states directly to do that, or developers to do that. And the simple equation will be, for every dollar, what gives us the most number of homes? It's going to be almost as simple as that. We'll try to make sure we have enough money going into regional and rural areas, but it's going to be a really simple equation. And in a sense, I don't want to offend them, but in a sense, we're trying to work around the state governments because, once bitten, twice shy. We've had state governments saying the right thing forever, and the results never change. In fact, they get worse. So rather than being at their mercy, we're going to work around them, and we're going to throw money at the problem to try and get an extra 500,000 homes, over a 5-year period out the door.
Well, Michael, let's turn to the demand side now, where the discussion has really focused on two areas, immigration and tax policy, and we want to take them one by one. So we'll start with immigration. You said a little earlier that at the moment there's sort of net overseas migration hovering around that 500,000 a year mark. How much does this actually affect house prices? And if you were to win back government, what levels of net overseas migration would you actually like to see?
Look, it really impacts the rental market very strongly, and it's very hard to quantify then what the impact is on the rest of the market. But it's easy to imagine that if we've seen rents in most major markets up by about 25% in the last couple of years, that pool of renters who are in many of those, well, in fact, in almost all cases, they're the next generation of first home buyers, that how much has their ability to purchase their first home been delayed by the fact that they're now spending 20-25% more on rent? And you don't need to be a financial guru to realise that that's going to have a massive, and is having a massive impact on delaying that ability to get the deposit together to buy a new house. So it does cascade all the way through the system. It's not just housing, but housing is obviously my focus. But all infrastructure has to keep up with your migration intake. I come from a migrant family, so I'm a great beneficiary of migration in a very personal way. But it's got to be planned migration, and the success of our country has been, we have done a pretty good job at planning our migration in a way that ensures that we maintain the standard of living for the people who are already here, and obviously provide great opportunities for new migrants who add so much to the country. We'll have a bit more to say about the specifics on numbers of net overseas migration, permanent migration. We've already outlined, for example, on permanent migration, where we're going, but it'll be a significant reduction. We don't walk away from that. We think that we need to take a bit of a breather, and we're still talking about by historical standards, pretty generous migration program, but heading to more than 500,000 a year when we're building 165,000 homes, you don't need to be a Rhodes Scholar to work out that maths doesn't work. So it'll be a pretty significant reduction, and in addition, a recalibration. So again, I don't want to offend anyone on your podcast, but maybe a few less yoga instructors, a few more bricklayers, because that's what is going to give our industry the productive capacity to build the homes we need to build. Because we need to build, say, 180, 200,000 homes a year just to keep our head above water. But we've got a 20-year accumulated deficit. So actually, we need to be lifting that to 220, 240 over a sustained period of time to start eating into the backlog. And you're not going to do that if our migration program is largely taken up by foreign students as opposed to people who actually have the skilled trades that at the moment we're a bit short on.
So, Michael, let's get to perhaps the most contentious conversation point when it comes to housing, and that's the tax treatment of housing, negative gearing, capital gains concession. There's plenty of debate, plenty of views around the tax settings for housing and the follow-on effects of that. So I guess at a high level, do you think we have the tax settings right?
Well, with respect to negative gearing, absolutely. I mean, there's no reason to treat housing different to any other asset. As you and your pretty savvy followers would know, there's no asset class that you can't negatively gear. I mean, in a sense, so you'd have to make a pretty good argument as to why it should be different for housing. And the people that do try to make that argument, I think, always ultimately fail. To go back to that earlier truism that I mentioned at the start of the podcast, if you want less housing, just tax it more. We made a decision 30 years ago. We wanted people to smoke less, so we started taxing the hell out of tobacco, and hey presto, it's gone down. In fact, there's a whole black market that's been created now because of the party. Anyway, we won't go there. If you accept that a third of people rent, and I don't think that's likely to go down significantly, the decision we have to make as a country is who on earth is going to own that stock? Because without a landlord, there's no tenant. Without a landlord, there's no property to rent. Now, in politics in Australia today, there's, I think, two varying sort of thoughts on it. There's one thought that says, make it as hard as possible for an Australian to own an investment property, tax it, more land tax, more regulations, more restrictions. And I can tell you all that will do is push up rents even further. Because in the end, if you tax a investor more, there's only one place they can go to make up that shortfall, and that is going to be ultimately their tenant. Or alternatively, you make it so unattractive that it's not worth holding an investment property, which, to be honest, is what's happening in Victoria at the moment, with land tax being what it is and a number of other rules. People will just get out altogether, and then all of a sudden you lose that. That rental stock is gone. The only other thing I'd add is some people think that the solution to that problem is to actually offer tax concessions to foreign corporate funds to own tens of thousands of Australian properties. And that's what the Albanese government has done. They've put in place the most concessional tax arrangements in the world for build to rent, which is just foreign corporate funds investing in Australia. And I have a philosophical problem with that. I think we want Australian homes being owned by Australians. 90% of investors own one property. I don't think Australia should go down the path of North America or the United States, where you have corporates who own tens of thousands of properties. Because I can tell you right now, a corporate who owns tens of thousands of properties are going to be looking at a certain hurdle rate of return every year that they need, come what may, and I don't think that's good for Australians in general. So we believe in Australians owning our housing stock. We think the tax arrangements for investing in housing should be no different to the tax arrangements for investing in other assets. You can negatively gear any other asset, so why would it be different for housing? And in fact, there are good arguments out there to suggest that governments should find ways of taxing housing less, because if you do that, you're likely to bring down the costs of housing by stimulating more supply and also directly for renters. So we've gone to two elections in 16 and 19 fighting the Labor Party on negative gearing and capital gains tax. They've now walked away from those policies. I think most intelligent people know that in their heart of hearts, Labor would still love to do it if they thought they could get away with it. But I think most people appreciate that there's something fundamentally wrong with the concept that all of a sudden taxing housing more is going to help anyone. Taxing housing more will help one person, and that's a Labor treasurer who wants more of your money to spend on irresponsible things and programs. It won't help a single Australian.
So that's negative gearing, and I think a lot of that debate probably got settled when Shorten lost in 2019. I think the Labor Party would be reluctant to bring it up again. But there's a lot of debate around the capital gains concessions around housing at the moment. That chart that shows the pretty steep inflection point in the early 2000s when there was some more generous housing tax concessions given, and that the difference between the median house price and the median salary really hit an inflection point and has sort of galloped away from there. So there's obviously something like tax treatment of housing has had an effect on housing affordability, and there is going to need to be a reckoning whether wages increase meaningfully, whether house prices flatline for a while and let wages keep up, or whether house prices come down. Like, something is going to have to change. Well, at least that's my contention. Do you agree that something needs to change? And if so, what would you change?
Oh, I agree something needs to change. You cannot have house prices as a multiple of median income continuing to go the way they've been going. I think anyone who dodges that question is not serious. So there's no doubt you need average wages to catch up. The only point I'd make just on your theory around the capital gains tax discount, which, let's remember, the CGT discount just replaced indexation. So indexation was always there. If you held a property, you were able to essentially apply CPI indexation to it. If you look at the inflection point as you describe it, Alex, that inflection point is almost universally replicated in virtually every other jurisdiction of which we would compare ourselves to. The United States, Canada, New Zealand, and none of them had a tax change like we had in '99. So I think, and I've seen Alan Kohler's comments on this where he draws that parallel. If he is correct, how on earth do you explain an almost identical thing happening in most other first English-speaking language world countries that we would compare ourselves to? Because they didn't have those tax changes. So I actually, I think it's something different. I've given it a lot of thought, and I'll take the coward's way out. I don't really have a great explanation for you, but I think you can rule out that it was the CGT discount because the CGT discount didn't change in 1999 in the United States, yet they've seen a virtually identical inflection point. I think in the end, if we do all of the things that we've sort of been talking about, making it easier for the market to meet spikes in demand, doing something as basic as bringing the cost down of building something. I would say, I'm in my 40s, so I'm older than you guys, but most people my generation grew up in a, 3-bedroom weatherboard house, a bit rickety. We're here to tell the tale. It was a good time in life. Now, though, with the building standards with where they're at, the costs are accelerated because you always have to build these gold-plated houses. And for some people, that'd be great. If you've got heaps of dough, good luck to you. But for most people trying to get on the property ladder, they don't have that. So, bringing down those costs, bringing down the regulation, incentivizing people to build again, having the healthy businesses with access to labour, access to materials to actually build those houses, and governments, importantly, who are aggressively pushing that agenda. I actually think you can bring down that multiple of income to house price. Now, it's not going to be particularly good for people like me who already own a property, because I suspect it'll mean that capital growth, as you say, will plateau. But I promise you, I think most Australians will be very happy to have their home plateauing over a period of time, giving wages a chance to catch up, than the alternative, which is, a generation of people who I fear at the moment we're on this trajectory because we've got a government who's not interested in first home buyers, who genuinely look at the numbers, and probably one of the reasons they follow your podcast, they think, well, it's going to be very hard for me to create wealth in property, so I'm going to have to work out other ways to do it. I think that would be a crying shame because, yes, there's a financial element to owning a home. There's no doubt about it. It's for most of us, your single biggest asset you'll ever own. But the most important part about housing in Australia is this. As a country, we've always had a culture where whether you are a barrister, whether you're a surgeon, or whether you're the office cleaner, if you work hard, you can have your own little patch of dirt in this country. And it means a lot more than just sort of the motherhood statement of it. It means, I think it's underpinned the sort of egalitarian nature of our society. We're not a class-based society. We like that sense of equality and fairness. I think it's been underpinned by people being able to own their own home, not necessarily the Taj Mahal, but their own home. And I think the consequences of if we get this wrong any further are much more significant than the economic consequences. I think the social consequences for who we are as a country is something I don't want to think about and something I don't want my children to have to face into the future.
So, Michael, one policy that the Coalition have announced that we want to get your take on is the Super for Housing policy, where first home buyers will be able to withdraw a portion of their super and put it towards their first home. So can you just give us a sense for people who may not have heard much about the policy, what the policy details are and what you expect the outcomes of that policy to be?
Yeah, sure. Well, it was a policy that I announced as Housing Minister before the last election, which would provide first home buyers with access to up to $50,000 of their super or 40% of their balance to put towards the deposit for a first home. The requirement, or one aspect of the policy, is it requires people who participate to recontribute that super back, or that amount back into their super, plus the relevant growth if they sell that first home. Now, we know most people hold their first home for about 8 years. So if, for example, you bought let's just use very round numbers, a $500,000 home, you withdrew $50,000 from your super to contribute to that, so 10% of the purchase price. You sold that home in 8 years' time for $1 million. You would be required to put the $50,000 that you took out from super back in at the end, plus a proportion of the growth, which in that case would be an extra $50,000. So 10% of that sale price, which represented 10% of the purchase price. So basically, it's a scheme to allow people to use super when they need it, which is for their deposit, but it protects their retirement savings by ensuring that they're still contributing that amount plus any growth back into super at the end. We think it's the best of both worlds because we know, for example, in Sydney, it takes people on average 12 years to save for a deposit. Meanwhile, as you're madly trying to save for that deposit, in many cases, the market can be running away from you. So we've got to find ways to break that nexus between savings and the deposit hurdle. And we think this is the best way to do it because in the end, super is your money. Doesn't belong to the fund manager. It doesn't belong to the finance bros on Collins Street in Melbourne or wherever they might be. It belongs to you. And I think it's been hugely frustrating for young people that they're madly trying to pay their rent, pay their bills, pay for ever increasing cost of living, also try and save some money for a deposit when they've got this growing pool of super, which is enforced contributions from the government. So we're very proud of the policy. We know it's very popular out there. And as I said, it's giving people the best of both worlds. Use the money when you need it for a deposit, but also protect your retirement savings at the same time.
Now, let me push you on this, Michael, because there's certainly a level of criticism that has come out against the policy, questioning around whether it will actually help first home buyers or it will just generally push prices up more across the board. But I think the particular argument against this policy has come from the New Zealand experience, where New Zealanders were able to access their KiwiSaver to buy first homes, and analysis found that it failed to lift home ownership rates across any age group. So how do you reconcile what happened in New Zealand with what you're proposing in Australia?
Well, I don't think you can draw any parallels. There's innumerable factors as to why they've had issues in New Zealand, and quite frankly, the disastrous state of their economy that unfortunately this government inherited from the former government is like a bit like what we're seeing now with the Albanese government, quite frankly. And so there's a range of other factors there. But let's be very frank here, gentlemen. The people who are arguing against this are the industry super funds, the union-run super funds. They want to control your money, and they don't want Australians to have an opportunity to have a say over their money, because they're remunerated very well, very, very well, I might say, by controlling your and my enforced savings. So let's be very clear. That's where the criticism is coming from. And secondly, at a broader level, is the argument seriously that the only way to improve housing affordability in this country is to give first home buyers less money? I mean, is that seriously? Let's take that argument to its natural extension. That if first home buyers have enough money for a deposit, that's a bad thing. So does that seriously mean that we should give first home buyers less firepower and that's somehow good for the housing market? I think it's an absolutely preposterous argument. What it's doing is it's giving first home buyers a competitive advantage, because people buying a second or third or subsequent property, they can't get access to the super. This is giving a competitive advantage to first home buyers. And in the end, we can keep doing things the way we've always been doing them. If that's the argument from the Labor Party and the industry super funds, fine. I mean, we'll keep going down the path we're going down, which is an ever-growing group of people who will never own a home. And we're trying to find ways of breaking that up. We think a very sensible way to do so is let people to get access to their own savings. It's not enforced, gentlemen, by the way. If you want to leave your money in super and not take it out to buy a house, you're well and truly entitled to do so. This is not a mandate. We're not forcing people to do it. But when you think about it, and you guys can crunch the numbers, if you take some money out of super to buy a home, once you've got the benefit of leverage, because you're able to leverage the purchase of a home, you are going to be in an infinitely better position when you enter retirement. You're going to probably own this fantastic asset being your home. Plus you will have very healthy super because of the requirement that we've placed on people to put that money back in at the end. So you're going to be, in net terms, infinitely better off. And we know from the intergenerational report and basically any serious study, if you enter retirement not owning a home, if you enter retirement renting, your financial outcomes are dire in comparison to someone who enters retirement owning a home. So, there's going to be a lot of hysterical claims made by the super funds who want to control your money or control the money of your listeners and viewers. We think it's their money and they should get the option to use it. Otherwise, are we seriously arguing that the way to deal with housing affordability is somehow to impoverish first home buyers and that somehow helps the market? I think that's a crazy argument.
Well, Michael, I think that's a good segue to our final question, which is for the many young Australians who are listening to this, both in the Equity Mates community and those who find this episode. Housing is a top priority for a lot of us, and deciding who to vote for is obviously pretty important when it comes to this policy. So what is your elevator pitch? If you were to wrap the episode with your 30-second pitch, what would it be?
Well, we're going to be singularly focused on helping people get into home ownership. We're not waving the white flag on home ownership. Whether it's helping you get over that deposit hurdle by getting access to a portion of your super to get that deposit together more quickly, whether it's access to finance or servicing your property, we've got a lot more to say in supporting you on that. Driving supply, 500,000 new homes. through pretty basic investments, and finally getting the costs down through less regulation and red tape. Very boring stuff, but I can assure you is critically important in keeping housing affordable for the people who are, I imagine, scraping together a deposit as we speak. And the best thing we can do, or the best statement I can make, is home ownership is again going to be the number one priority for the Australian government, which sadly I don't think it's been the priority in the past 3 years.
Well, Michael Sukkar, thank you for making the time and sharing your thoughts with the Equity Mates community.
Thanks, Bryce. Thanks, Alec.
Welcome back to Equity Mates Investing Podcast. We've just heard from Shadow Housing Minister Michael Sukkar. Ren, now we have the Minister for Housing, Clare O'Neil.
Yeah, that's right. So this interview is in two parts. You'll hear the first part of our interview with Clare before the most recent policy announcements, and then there'll be a 10-minute appendix at the end where we caught up again to chat about their policy announcements for this election, the 5% deposit and the $100 billion plan to build homes specifically for first home buyers. So let's get to it. This is our interview with Housing Minister Clare O'Neil.
Well, Clare, welcome to Equity Mates.
Great to be here, guys. Thanks for having me on your show.
Now, there's a lot that you guys, both sides of politics, disagree on, but we want to start by asking you, when it comes to housing, what is it that you agree on when it comes to your opposition?
Oh, that is a hard one, actually. We do have two extremely different approaches. I think everyone in Australian politics today recognises that we've got real challenges with housing. I would say we're the only party with a real plan to take the housing crisis head on. But in terms of areas of agreement, I doubt you're going to have many Liberals coming on your show saying that there's no problem with housing at the moment and, that there's nothing for government to do here. But that's about as far as I can take it. No, it's interesting you asked me that. I'm not a politician who jumps into conflict unnecessarily. I actually really want the Parliament to work together wherever we can. But I hope you see, and I hope the people listening understand, we've got a massive problem on our hands, in no small part caused by 9 years of total neglect of this problem by the coalition. And we've got a real plan to fix this, with which Peter Dutton wants to kind of rip up and throw in the bin. So there are, unfortunately, quite a few stark differences here.
Yes.
Well, let's hold on the problem before we move to the plan. And I think, it's become one of the defining policy issues of this election, especially amongst young voters. But how would you define the problem? Like, what specifically is the issue with housing in Australia?
Yeah. So we've got a housing crisis in our country that's been cooking for a generation. And if we go back all the way to about 1980, we can start to see that house prices and incomes start to diverge, and then they diverge and they diverge and they diverge. And this is a 40-year-old problem. So if we go back to 2000, average house prices were about 4 times median incomes, and today it's about 8. So we've got a big problem on our hands that is a generation in the making, and in no small part caused by lots of governments at different levels and their failure to do enough about it. If I can just dig a little bit deeper on that, because the most important thing I want people listening to understand is that all the housing woes that people are experiencing, almost, come back to the fact that we've got a housing shortage in our country. We have a supply problem for that whole period since the 1980s. Effectively, we have not been building enough homes, and that problem has seriously come home to roost, and it is creating extreme pain for lots of people around the country, and especially for young people who are facing radically different housing chances than their parents and grandparents got. So that's why our government is so fiercely seized of this problem and has such a deep commitment really to try to take this on. We're the first Commonwealth government to really try this, really since the post-war period, so it's a big undertaking.
I think that chart that you mentioned is quite well known. Alan Kohler has certainly done the rounds talking about it and showing it, and it shows that sharp inflection point in the early 2000s. Do you attribute that divergence between median house price and median income purely to supply? Is that the only thing that you'd put that down to?
Look, it's everything. Economics is supply and demand. I don't think anything's completely only a supply issue, but the fundamental issue is that we haven't been building enough homes. And when we look at how many houses we have per 1,000 Australians, we have a lower number of homes than most of the other countries that we'd ordinarily compare ourselves to. So there's just no question whether it's house prices rising too fast, too quickly, whether it's all those people listening who feel they've got no negotiating power with their landlord, or even that rising share of people that are actually without secure housing altogether. All these things are going to be addressed by us focusing on building, and making sure we've got more housing, because more housing means more affordable housing for Australians.
So let's stay on the supply side and dig into it a little bit, and we'll start more generally. When you say that there's a supply issue, what are the big drivers of that? Is it planning policy, zoning, tax? Like, what do you think are the real issues at hand?
There's lots of things, and I think it's kind of helpful to just imagine like a big jigsaw puzzle that we're trying to build here, and there's no one single piece that's going to, be the cause of this or the solution to it. There's many things that have gone wrong and many things that have to change. But if I can put one factor on it, it's just the failure of governments at every level to prioritise the building of more homes. And while governments have stepped back, so if I can give you an example, in 2013 when Tony Abbott was elected, he actually withdrew the Commonwealth altogether from housing policy. That's why for most of the period of the former coalition government, they actually didn't have a Commonwealth Housing Minister at all. They just washed their hands. This has nothing to do with us. And when you do that, you allow the build-up of lots of different problems. So it's planning reform at a state level. It's taxes and other regulatory issues that get in the way of building. It's funding at the Commonwealth level, a problem that we've really been involved in trying to address. It's construction productivity. All of these things basically have built up over a really long period of time. And that's why pulling it apart is complicated. Anyone in this debate who's like, I've got the silver bullet, there's just this one thing we need to change and suddenly this is going to go away, they're not a credible participant in this debate. What this requires is obsessive focus every day on the experience of young people in this market and doing everything we can to try to help them get into a better spot.
Well, unfortunately, Claire, you are the housing minister, so people expect you to have a
silver bullet. Fortunately, guys.
And so as part of your government's, housing policy, you set the big target with the states, 1.2 million homes over 5 years starting halfway through 2024.
Yeah.
And according to some, we're already behind. Now, you might disagree with that characterization, but I think whether or not we're on track is kind of beside the main point, which is it's really hard to build still. So what are the levers that you're pulling and how are you trying to solve some of that jigsaw puzzle that you mentioned earlier?
Sure.
Yeah.
So just stepping back quickly, big solution, we've got a housing shortage, big solution is to build more homes. So what the PM has done is sat down with the leaders of states and territories and local government and said, guys, we've got a problem here, how are we going to work together to fix it? And they've built something called the National Housing Accord. So this is a national agreement where the states and the Commonwealth are working together to try to build 1.2 million homes. And the Commonwealth in particular is funding masses more social and affordable homes, which hopefully we'll get to because that's a really undercooked kind of discussed part of the problem. So we're trying to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years that will relieve pressures in the housing market. We're doing that by asking the states to enact quite significant planning reform, and you're seeing that here in New South Wales, you're seeing it in Victoria or in many places around the country. We're making sure that we get the dollars behind this, putting the funding in place. We're funding lots of infrastructure, which is like the boring but important, pipes and footpaths and those sorts of things that if we push onto developers, the developments won't go ahead or they'll be too expensive. So that's just a handful of some of the things that we're doing. But basically, that 1.2 million target is really important. And I want people to know from an ambition point of view, we've got to be ambitious. It's going to be very difficult to build 1.2 million homes. And the answer to this is not to wave the white flag and rip this up and say, oh, we'll just do what we do, which is honestly what the Liberals are saying. We've got to strive and push, and that's the only way we're going to get a solution here.
I've always wondered when you sit down and create an accord like that with the states involved, is there any accountability on them actually doing it within the time frame? Like, how does that relationship actually work?
Yeah, well, honestly, it is challenging. What you need to do is think about it piece by piece, basically. So just if I can give you a quick example, we did something called the Social Housing Accelerator, which was $2 billion to the states to build more social housing. If they haven't spent the money by a particular period, the money comes back to the Commonwealth. And we do that with a few different types of programs. But, one of the many complexities in housing is that responsibility is shared across Commonwealth, state and local government. Now, I'm so sorry for all your listeners who I'm sending to sleep with this short summary of constitutional law in Australia.
That's good.
But one of the things I really notice is that some of the biggest problems we face that are most intractable as a country, they share this feature of being shared across all the levels of government. We can't change the constitution unless anyone wants to go back to another referendum, maybe too soon. So we have to work collaboratively with the states, and that's what I think you see the PM doing. I think he's a firm leader of the country, but we've got to have a partnership here. And just one final thing I would say, one thing that's really different about housing even 5 years ago is the level of political commitment at the state level. And that's not coming just from the Commonwealth. It's coming from the people listening who are saying to every level of government, guys, you have got to change this. We cannot see this problem get worse. And that's why we're getting good collaboration, I think, really for the first time across the Commonwealth.
Now, you mentioned social housing there, and I think one of the flagship policies of your government was the Housing Australia Future Fund. So I guess talk to us a little bit about how you think it's gone so far, and I believe we will have first year's returns at this point. So tell us a little bit about the money that's we've earned from the fund so far.
Great. So the Housing Australia Future Fund is a fund that will assist us in building and maintaining social and affordable housing in perpetuity. It's a fund that generates a return and government uses the return to build and maintain social and affordable homes. We have an aspiration as a government to build 55,000 social and affordable homes. About 30,000 of those will come from the Housing Australia Future Fund. The reason that's so innovative is because I'm just sharing this with you because you're an investment podcast. So I probably wouldn't do this in normal media. But basically what we're trying to do is crowd in other sources of capital. So what we do is the Commonwealth gives a payment to successful applicants, but it's like a reverse auction. So if you've got land from a church, if you've got the state government kicking in some money, if you've got the super funds maybe helping you out, then you are going to be in a better position to get half money. And it just makes the Commonwealth dollar go much further because we're basically forcing people to collaborate. So this is a truly fantastic feature of housing in our country. For those who are listening who don't know a lot about this, the Australian government, in fact governments generally in Australia, we haven't been as active in helping, if you like, the kind of bottom 20% of people in the community who are always going to struggle in the private market. If you look at other countries in the world, often government is much more actively engaged with housing that part of the population. And I'm not aware of any OECD country where government has no role. This is just an ordinary feature of housing markets. Not everyone can find safe and affordable accommodation. And of course, a beautiful, rich country like Australia, we're not going to tolerate homelessness and other people being in distress. So we need to start to fill that shortfall, and we're doing that through the Housing Australia Future Fund. So we've got thousands of homes under construction right now under the fund. I was just at Arncliffe. If you're from Sydney, you'll know where that is, visiting an absolutely massive site, like I mean a massive site where we're building a lot of Housing Australia Future Fund homes. And this is a really big and important part of our housing offering.
Nice. So one other thing I want to touch on the supply side is productivity, and especially construction industry productivity, because there's two data points that I think are relevant to this conversation. In the 2024 financial year, ASIC reported that 2,832 construction companies went into insolvency in Australia. And we sort of heard of that post-COVID. Inflation was high, materials were high, a lot of fixed cost builders went out of business. But then the Productivity Commission earlier this year had a finding that the Australian housing construction sector is only building half as many homes relative to the number of hours worked compared to 30 years ago. So this is going to be like the big enabler of these goals, the construction sector. So how do we help the construction sector get more productive, not go insolvent, and actually build more homes that we need?
Yeah. So it's a really good question because you're right. At the end of the day, if we want to build 1.2 million homes the key to that is actually enabling construction in Australia to build more homes than they're currently capable of doing. And that's really difficult and complicated, but we've got to do it because it matters. So the Productivity Commission, you mentioned that report they did. People listening should go and have a look. It's really, really interesting. So one of the things I just want to mention is construction productivity is a really big problem all over the world. It's not just in Australia. And in fact, you probably remember reading that construction productivity is actually held up a little bit better here than most of the countries that we'd sort of compare ourselves to. But what can we do about this? The single biggest thing is regulation and planning holdups. So we've basically, from my perspective, trotted along as a country for decades, building planning systems that protect existing residents with very little thought to how we're going to make room for more people. And I think that conversation's really starting to shift. Like, you guys have been observing the housing discussion probably for your own for a long time. You would have seen the politics of this are really changing. Young people coming into the discussion, the YIMBY movement really pushing, and obviously we've played a role too. So we've asked the states to make pretty radical shifts in their planning reform. What I would say is there's a lot else in there. Skills is really important. Construction techniques is a big one too. So we're still basically building homes the same way that we were 30 years ago. So we shouldn't be that surprised that it's not getting cheaper. We're not innovating enough. So the government's done some important things here. What I would say is that we need to just tackle this problem with the construction industry every day. We've done those important things in the first term, but I just think there's a lot more work to do here. And again, it's not one shot in the locker kind of stuff. It's actually gritty work, sitting down with them and saying, how can we fix this? How can we reduce that? Tax is an issue at a state level for them that we need to get into. So these are the sorts of things that need to be done.
So Claire, we want to drill into the demand side of things now. And on that side of the discussion, there's really two key areas: immigration and tax policy. We want to take them one by one, starting with immigration. So net overseas migration is hovering around that 500,000 mark. And we really want to know how much that affects house prices, but also what levels of migration you'd like to see.
Really important question. And I think the first thing to say is, of course, migration has a role to play here. It's a piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And so that's why our government is working to bring migration back to sustainable levels. So after COVID, the borders had been shut for almost 2 years. We saw a surge in migration off the back of that, and we're bringing migration down to what is basically normal. That's about 235,000 people a year, and that's what's reflected in the Treasury forecasts. I do want to say, though, I think that some people exaggerate the kind of pivotalness, if you like, of this. If we look at what happened during COVID, our population went back for the first time since the Second World War, first time in 70 years, and house prices absolutely exploded. So I think we can see there's not a completely direct link here, but of course it's a part of the discussion.
I think that's a good point that gets lost in a lot of the immigration discussions. 2021 was nuts. 2021 was nuts for everything.
Don't take us back there. I'm just on PTSD.
I'll tell you what, it was good for an investing podcast though. Everything was going up. Crypto, NFTs. Take us back.
Exactly. I'm sure everyone was at home just looking for some ways to start their investing journey.
Good. So let's move to tax policy. It is... It sparks anger every time you post it online. If we ever want engagement on anything we post, housing tax policy, negative gearing, capital gains concessions. There's a lot of debate around the tax settings for housing. So I guess before we ask specifically about some of these, just generally, do we have the tax settings right?
We've made some pretty important changes in our first term that are all about making sure that we bring more supply online and make it available to Australians. And I think that's got to be the prism for everything. We don't have any further tax changes planned with regard to housing. Just to quickly mention a couple of them to you, we made a really significant decrease in taxes paid on build-to-rent properties. So this is a kind of development which I think is going to play a pretty important part of getting more housing online in our country. The tax change we made in the last term it will create basically about 80,000 new homes over the coming decade. It's quite hard for me to look at one single thing I can do to create that level of supply impact. So that's one of them. And then I think you guys would have caught we've instituted a ban on foreign investors from buying into property in Australia. That's not going to solve the problem again, but it is important. It's something just over 1,800 homes a year that will now be available for Australians.
Is that any property or just existing?
That's just existing properties, So we want to maintain that pro-supply angle. And again, for everyone listening, and indeed for the negative gearing capital gains tax conversation, the principal way we should be thinking about all of this is what is it going to do to our ability to build more homes for the people that need them in our country.
So no tax changes in the next term of government on housing?
Nothing's been discussed, not at all. Nothing's been planned. So we've made those two changes. And again, like the Prime Minister, he's been pretty open about this. We had people looking at this and he looked at it himself and said, I'm not confident that this is not going to have a negative supply impact, so we're not going to proceed with it.
Yeah. So one policy that has been proposed for the next term of government, not by your side of the aisle, but by the coalition, is this super for housing policy. So I'm just going to ask it as simply as super for housing thoughts.
It's a terrible idea, and there's a few truly dumb things knocking around in housing, and this is definitely one of them. And I really want people to understand what a danger this is to all the young people who are listening. First thing that super for housing will do is immediately lift house prices. And I don't mean like over a period of time. I mean, we're talking about one weekend, a bunch of young people are going to auctions, all with roughly the same amount more money in their pocket. All that is going to do is lift house prices. Some of the analysis suggests $70,000 straight off the top in Sydney. The other thing it will do is basically take that retirement wealth that young people are saving and effectively gift it to an older generation who own all the property. Like, if we wanted to make the problem worse, this would be a really good place to start. The research shows that young people will be worse off in their retirement. Why should young people today trash their retirement savings to buy a house when no other Australian generation has been asked to do that before? And if you're not convinced by me, Sol Westlake, probably Australia's preeminent housing economist, at least amongst a handful, he said that if the Liberals were to proceed with this, it would be the worst public policy mistake of the 21st century. Like, this is a really smart guy. And just one more thing I'm going to tell you.
Didn't he just say that about the GST redistribution?
Oh, I didn't see that.
He called it the worst public policy mistake of the 20th century.
Okay, maybe he's used that line more than once, but that doesn't change the fact he did say it about super for housing. But I just want to say one more thing about super for housing. Have a look at the history of Peter Dutton, of Malcolm Turnbull, of so many Liberals who have said for years, super's for your retirement and we don't want young people to trash their super to buy a house. And now suddenly they're out arguing for the policy. Like, come on, guys, it is trash, bad for the property market, bad for young people, and it will be a real danger if Peter Dutton's elected Prime Minister.
So the Andrew Braggs of the world would counter that allowing young people to access their super and not giving the same leg up to investors and multiple homeowners gives them on a relative basis more of a leg up. What's your response to that?
It doesn't change any of the things that I just said to you. We still have young people bidding against each other, raising house prices. We've still got young people taking their retirement savings and gifting them to, frankly, wealthy baby boomers. Like, come on, guys. It's got all of these inherent difficulties. And can I just say to you, it just allows the Liberals to avert the real problem here, which is that for a decade they sat around and did bugger all about this problem, and now they want to come forward and put this forward as like a fig leaf policy. They don't have a plan to build more homes in Australia. They don't have a plan to build a single social and affordable home in our country when that's something that's desperately needed. Everything we've tried to do on housing this term, Peter Dutton stood in the path of, and now he wants you to trust him with this really urgent problem for the country. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, Claire, for young Australians listening who have housing as a top priority when deciding who to vote for, what is your final pitch? What's your elevator pitch to them?
My elevator pitch is that you didn't deserve this problem, and I just want to say that we recognise how much pain this is causing for people, really serious pain. Housing is one of those things that's so fundamental to our existence as human beings that when you run into problems with it, it's not the same as other less meaningful things. This is really important, and that's why it's so important to our government. So we are the first Australian government, really since the Second World War, to say we are going to take a run at addressing this massive problem for the country. We're building more homes, trying to build 1.2 million over the coming 5 years and 55,000 social and affordable. We haven't talked much about renters, but we've got some really important things that we've done for renters over the past 3 years. And then we want to help people get into the housing market. So things like expanding the home guarantee scheme. We've helped 150,000 young people into the market through that. And Help to Buy, this shared equity scheme, will come online a little bit later this year. So we've got a really big plan here, and we just need to be able to get on and implement it. By contrast, the Liberals just want to take us back to the past, where the Commonwealth was just a casual observer of this debate and wasn't really taking it seriously and doing what's needed.
Well, Clare O'Neil, we're glad we have a housing minister again. It's good.
Me too.
It's good that this is an issue front and centre, because
massive,
it's certainly front and centre in our community, and I think the wider community. So thanks for joining us today.
Great. Awesome to chat to you guys. Thanks.
Well, Claire, welcome back to Equity Mates.
Thanks, guys. Thank you so much for giving me a second bite of the cherry here. I love your work.
Well, yeah, since we last spoke to you, there's been two pretty significant announcements in the housing space as we lead up to the election. So for those who missed it, can you briefly explain what the policies are?
Sure. I spoke to you two before about those really critical foundations that Labor laid in the first term in office, building more homes, helping renters get a better deal, and getting more Australians into home ownership. The PM's now announced two new game-changing reforms that we will pursue in a second term, and it will see our government going much further on housing. So the two things for your listeners to understand is the first thing we will do is provide every young person in the country with an opportunity to get into housing with just a 5% deposit. We want your listeners to be in a position where they're paying off their own mortgage and not someone else's. And we want to make sure that we've got housing stock available for those young people. So our government's going to do something that no Commonwealth government's ever done before, and partner with the states to build 100,000 homes around the country that will be sold exclusively to first home buyers. So this is just a clean shot at getting into your first home, no intervention or competition from property investors or from other generations. Really, this is about the government going all in on first home ownership. We've done really important work in the first term, and this is about building on that and providing better support to young people.
So two policies, one on the supply side, one on the demand side. Love to see that there is some supply side stuff there. But I guess that there's a question that comes around timing. Like the demand side of it could come on pretty quickly, almost straight away if you're re-elected. But the supply will take years to build. In the short term, won't that further drive up prices?
Well, remember that we're building on what is an existing tens of billions of dollar agenda to build more homes. What I think has been a little bit missed in the media commentary I've seen about this is that supply, that is building more homes, was already at the heart of Labor's agenda. We had, roughly a $20 billion investment going into building more homes before these announcements. Now it's 32. So I want you to understand we are building more homes. But the other thing I would just say, guys, is I have seen some of the expert commentary, and I'm very respectful of people who are in the debate, but what they're really saying is that young people around the country should have to wait until we build our way out of the problem that we're in at the moment. And I don't agree. I just don't agree. I talk to young people all the time who will do anything to just get into that first rung on the ladder. And this is a policy for them. For young people that don't want to take on additional borrowings, that's absolutely fine. This is not compulsory. It's just an additional choice for everyone who's listening. And if I can just say one more thing, I think a lot of people listening will really relate to this. We've got a generation of young people in Australia right now who are telling us that they are delaying things like putting off starting a family. They're not taking on further study. They're not working in jobs that are right for them because they don't have stable housing. And this is a part of an answer for those young people around the country.
So I guess if you are looking for the first home, it is pretty exciting to hear that you're committing to 100,000 new homes built. Is there any indication on where those are likely to be?
Well, they'll be well located because that's part of the goal of the government. And one of the fantastic things about our government committing to roll up its sleeves and actually get involved in building homes just for first home buyers is that we have a lot of control. one of the main things that the Commonwealth brings to the table when we're talking about building more homes is the use of land that's owned by local, state and federal government. If you go right around the country, you'll find some of the choicest land around the nation is owned by governments, but no one's got the capital to build the kind of housing that we most need, which is entry-level housing for those young people who are coming into the market for the first time. So it's not just sort of spraying, the gangster gun around and trying to get people to build more homes that way. We're actually being really targeted about building exactly the kind of homes that young people are going to find themselves in first off the mark.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've got to say, I saw your interview on Insiders when these policies were announced over the weekend, and I think I really appreciated how your rhetoric sort of meets the moment where people are. Like, young people feel like this is a crisis and this is the biggest thing in their lives, and your rhetoric certainly meets that. I guess my question then becomes, if this is such a crisis, if this is such an emergency, was there consideration of bigger measures, like measures to take demand out of the system from property investors and the like in the short term until we can get more, actually bring prices down and actually kind of meet the crisis and the moment that it is?
I think we are meeting the crisis. We are doing staggeringly more than any Australian government has done since the post-war period, when we went through, go and look at the history and look at the size and shape of the housing crisis that we experienced then. The way for us to get out of this is to build more homes. And I hope everyone's hearing that in the discussion. For all the, fiery debates that are going on, there's one simple truth. Our country has not been building enough homes for 40 years, and there's no simple quick fix for that problem. Now, you ask about, just let me make one more point about the size of this. We're talking about a $43 billion agenda. Like, that is absolutely massive in size. And 32 billion of that is going into the supply side, making sure that we're building more homes. So just park that for a second. On your question about tax concessions, it's not part of Labor's plan because we are so focused on making sure that we bring more supply onto the market. And those tax changes that you're referring to, they're not going to help us in any way build more homes around the country, which is the number one policy goal of our government.
They might take demand out on the demand side and help bring prices down that way.
Look, most of the research suggests that any change on that front will be really minimal. That's the truth. I think it's taken on, I understand, because I think a lot of the housing debate for a long time, for some reason, has focused on these tax concessions as though, they're a talismanic issue and somehow if we change the tax system, that's our silver bullet and suddenly all these problems will go away. The evidence just doesn't support that. The fundamental problem is we have not been building enough homes for 40 years, and our government is the first since the post-war period to seriously roll up our sleeves and step into that market and say, we are not going to rely on the private sector to build the housing that we need, because that's never worked in any country in the world. We're actually going to get involved in making sure that the type of stock we need at the volume we need is coming online.
Well, Claire, to close out, we wanted just to get your comments on the coalition policy. They've come out with an additional policy on top of the one we already knew, which was the ability to withdraw $50,000 from superannuation. They've now said that a portion of mortgages will now be tax deductible, or at least the interest component anyway. What are your thoughts on that and how it is going towards solving the housing crisis?
Yeah, it's not a housing policy because the mortgage proposal they have won't build a single additional home, and it won't help a single renter into home ownership. So what you're hearing from the coalition on this is a generational triple whammy. Peter Dutton wants young people to not only be paying off their landlord's mortgage, he now wants them to subsidise the mortgages of people who already own homes around the country, and he wants you to set fire to your superannuation in a way that we know will burn up house prices around the country. And if we were trying to find a way to make the housing crisis dramatically worse and immediately worse, then this is about where I'd start. Just remember, with the Liberals, aside from all those negative things, they're obsessed with demand side interventions. But just remember, with the Liberals, they have no way to address the chronic problem in our country, and that is that we haven't been building enough homes. And Labor's offering a real answer on that one.
Well, Clare O'Neil, we thank you for joining us again, and I think that as I said earlier, like how you're talking and the fact that it's so front of mind, the fact that you're so front of mind in this election is a sign I think, of how important housing is. And we're glad that you're talking about it because, it's a massive issue. In our community.
Massive. I mean, I talk to young people, guys. Like, I reckon every young person in this country has got a chronic housing issue in their lives is somewhere in their orbit. Like, this is a massive issue. We've reached a tipping point, and finally we've got a government that wants to actually stand up and do something meaningful about it. That's good. Positive.
Well, thank you for joining us today, and all the best for the next couple of weeks.
Love your work, guys.
Thanks,
See you later.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of today's episode. A huge thank you to both parties for coming on. Thank you to Claire and thank you to Michael. Housing is no doubt a massive topic here amongst the Equity Mates community. So I hope you've been able to I guess, be a bit more educated on what the parties are bringing to this election. And a reminder that we have sat down with both the Treasurer and Shadow Treasurer as well. And that episode will be live in your feed. That's the Treasurer Jim Chalmers and Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor.
Now, if you're new to Equity Mates and you've just watched this episode because you're interested in the Australian election and Australian housing, make sure you subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. We break down the world of investing to make it accessible for everyone. If you're new to investing, we also have a sister YouTube channel and podcast creatively called Get Started Investing. And we also have a daily news email that gives you a dot point summary of what's happening around the world in your inbox every morning at 6 a.m. So make sure you subscribe to that. But look, Bryce, that does it for today. If you are in Australia, don't forget to vote. Remember, you can vote early. And we'll see what happens on the 3rd of May.
I will say this about investing. Everything you do learn is cumulative. What I learned at 20 is useful. Equity.